So far, these are nuclear targets, nuclear scientists, and then, of course, the senior most military leaders who have been quickly replaced by the supreme leader. But if the supreme leader thought next on the agenda was actually attacking the regime itself, the political leadership, I think you'd see the gloves off, and then you could see some really uncontrolled escalation.
Air raid sirens have been heard in Jerusalem as the Israeli military say they've identified missiles launched from Yemen. Earlier, I spoke with Gabrielle Weiniger, who's the Israel correspondent for The Times, based in Tel Aviv. She told me that Israelis are getting prepared for further attacks.
I think Iran's been really taken off guard. Their senior commanders have been wiped out. Israel's really waiting for some kind of response. People are being sent to the shelters. We're being told to pay attention to home front commands. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen this evening when night falls, and Israelis are certainly preparing for that.
Meanwhile, Iranian media is reporting that multiple blasts have been heard near Tehran and near Iran's Fordow nuclear site. Iran has called the attacks a declaration of war and says the gates of hell will open on Israel. Masoud Pezeshkian, Iran's president, said the attacks were unprovoked.
This barbaric act that violated all international commitments confirms the criminal nature of the illegitimate Zionist regime that has based its existence on occupation, aggression and killing children.
But Israel's ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, said the overnight strikes were necessary to eliminate an existential threat.
Israel uncovered clear evidence that the Iranian regime was planning a surprise attack in coordination with their proxies. They had planned to invade from all sides, with thousands of terrorists and thousands of projectiles. Israel could not and would not wait for that moment to arrive. The decision to act last night was not made lightly. It followed repeated violations by the Iranian regime, continued deception, and an absence of meaningful international consequences.
Well, Barbara Leaf, former United States Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs until January the 2025, is on the line now, and she was the US Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates before that. Ambassador Leaf, thank you very much for joining us, and good evening to you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Delighted to be on the show.
Well, let me start by getting your take on how dangerous you think this moment is for Israel, for the US, and indeed for the world.
Well, look, I mean, undoubtedly there is heightened peril here in many directions. Of course, towards Israel itself, which, as you reported earlier, is under attack right now from the south, from the Yemen's Houthis. Of course, there is always the risk when you have state-on-state exchanges, kinetic exchanges, as we saw last year in April and October between Iran and Israel. There is very heightened risk that escalates. So I think the determinative issue for the moment is how the Trump administration, postures itself over the next few days.
Well, what do you think of what you've heard from Donald Trump in the last 24 hours, and what would you be advising him?
So look, I go back to something you said earlier, that there is a sort of an ideological prioritization in the regime of animosity, more than animosity, adversary, enemy sort of language towards Israel and the US, the West, longstanding. But there is an underlying priority above all else, which is regime survival. So this is the point where calibration will become increasingly important, and calibration on what Israel does next, how it responds, and watching how Iran takes in what are, by any measure, shocking blows. There are many other things Israel could have done in this first round, and it has not yet. We'll see what the second round reveals in these next hours.
Well, what do you think they might do in that second round then? Just explain a little bit more what you're referring to there.
Right. Well, I think anything that suggests that Israel is going after the political leadership of the regime itself. So far, these are nuclear targets, nuclear scientists, and then, of course, the senior most military leaders who have been quickly replaced by the supreme leader. But if the supreme leader thought next on the agenda was actually attacking the regime itself, the political leadership, I think you'd see the gloves off, and then you could see some really uncontrolled escalation.
Very interesting to hear that. The US has been at pains to point out that it was aware of what Israel was doing, but Israel equally clear that this was their operation. One of the results of what's happened is that these talks on Sunday, the nuclear talks that the US and Iran were holding, they've been called off by Iran. How will Trump be dismayed by that or not?
No, I think it's pretty clear that the president regards this as sort of a massive piece of leverage to use over this next period to get what he wants, which is a diplomatic deal on the nuclear program. I think for the moment, and that moment may be very long, diplomatic activity is unlikely as the regime assesses and decides how to calibrate its response to Israel. And, there's been a flurry of drones, but suffice to say, you can expect much more than that.
Yeah, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But just talk about this leverage point that you're talking about. I mean, how soon could talks in theory resume? And, how it's a high stakes gamble by both the US and Israel. And they've got different interests in this, of course, but do you think Trump will end up having a better chance of getting a deal in those nuclear talks whenever they do resume after what's happened in the last 24 hours?
Right. This is where the calibration piece over these next days is going to be acutely important because, again, if the supreme leader thinks Israel's coming for him, for the regime, is in the business of regime change, suffice to say, there's no room for diplomacy, especially on the nuclear program. So this will require some real artfulness over time, both holding back what Israel may have on its menu of options, and then leaning in coercively. It would appear, but leaning in to push the regime to get back to the table. But I don't think there's any prospect, probably for weeks at the least, under these circumstances where the regime feels threatened, where Khamenei has been humiliated. There's virtually no prospects of going back to the table.
Right. So how do you anticipate Iran now responding beyond, obviously, the limited actions that it's taken so far?
Well, as we say in America, this is the $64 question, isn't it? Because this is unprecedented. And look, I've been thinking about the region for several years now as being visited by an excess of black swan events, and this is yet another. So last year you had the first state-on-state attack by Iran on Israel, quite remarkable in its way. You'd had that denied but pretty apparent a state-on-state attack by Iran on Saudi Arabia in 2019. But this is an entirely different domain now. Iran does not have its ring of proxies to deploy. Let's see what the Iraqi militias do. Let's see what Hezbollah does more than bleat threatening rhetoric. I think the Houthis are always up for a fight, so they will throw themselves at this, but they're not particularly adept at this point.
I mean, do you think that there's a sense, isn't there, that Iran and its proxies are much depleted, and that they won't be able to muster much of a response? Is that wishful thinking?
No, it's not wishful thinking. They are much depleted. There's no question. Even the Iraqi militias have been in a state of sort of existential angst and anxiety about where they go. They watched the IDF essentially take Hezbollah apart. Now, it is not gone. It has still got capacity, and it still has the desire to regenerate, but it is much depleted. And it was the crown jewel of Iran's, ring of fire, if you will. So Iran does not itself have a lot to rely on in terms of what has been a decades-long approach to the region of using this offensive defense, if you will. That's a set of euphemisms, but it's really using these proxies to keep all of the region in a state of, some uncertainty, the near abroad in a state of destabilization and insecurity and weakness.
Just standing back finally. When you look at what's going on now in the Middle East, you look at the enduring conflict in Ukraine, Sudan, I could name a whole other series of conflicts. It does start to look, doesn't it, like the world is at war.
Well, yes, that's been the feeling I think a lot of us have had for a couple of years. And yet, I think uh, there's there is always a diplomatic set of options available, and when you deploy that diplomacy in this setting becomes really critical. And if I go back to that issue of the proxies, the IDF, but also the attritional force on Russia of Ukraine, and under the Biden administration with NATO support, et cetera, wore the Russians down in Syria. Iran the supreme leader made a set of huge miscalculations. Hezbollah was taken to pieces. And so you had this sudden clearing of the landscape in Lebanon and Syria for the first time in 4 or 5 decades of Iranian presence and predatory control and so forth. So there's a lot to be done with that. If things tip too far in a military direction on Iran, we risk seeing any advantages from taking pieces of the nuclear infrastructure taken apart, et cetera, really lost, and then you can tip things into full-on conflict. And of course, that's something we would all want to avoid.
Barbara Leaf, thank you very much for your time. Ambassador Leaf, it's very good to hear your expert take on all these stories today.